Haven't made a video in quite a while, but I felt moved as I have heard Fr Stephen DeYoung make a statement that Christ's flesh is infinite, that the saints' deified flesh is infinite, and that this is due to the Communicatio idiomatum. He's made this statement a number of times. He made it in a podcast on Lord of Spirits on December 30th of last year, and then on a couple of podcasts since then. He claims that this is from the Communicatio idiomatum. And he claims that the Communicatio idiomatum is that the properties of each nature are applied to each other. He also claims this is in St John of Damascus. So, as usual, we will hear what he says, and then we will go to what the saints actually say.
I don't want to steal his whole bit.
Right. Just, we did have somebody who asked a question right before we were in the middle of talking about the end of the world. Someone wanted to have clarification on how Nestorianism can be connected to Calvinism, or it can have Calvinistic tendencies, or perhaps it's the other way around.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. One is in terms of how they make penal substitutionary atonement work. And so the core of penal substitutionary atonement is the idea that Christ died a spiritual death. Right? It is Christ died a spiritual death so we won't have to. So to back up a step, as St John of Damascus lays this out really well. Other fathers use this terminology all the time, but St John of Damascus, as usual, sort of lays it out very nicely, right?
We'll just pause here. Just keep in mind, he has claimed this is in St John of Damascus.
There is physical death, which is the separation of the soul from the body. And there is spiritual death, which is the separation of the soul from God.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Experiencing hell, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is how we understand what happens when Adam is expelled from paradise. You know, on the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Well, he doesn't die physically on that day. He dies spiritually on that day. Right. And then as a result of that spiritual death, physical death eventually befalls him.
I want to pause here. I have absolutely nothing wrong with this. This is absolutely correct. Because we are born spiritually dead, our souls are dead, our bodies will eventually die, and we experience physical death. This is entirely true. Totally true.
Right. It is a result of the other. So everyone understands that Christ dies a physical death. His human soul is separated from his human body at the time of his death on the cross. Okay. And so, for example, St. Gregory Palamas says, by Christ's physical death, right, he does away with our physical and spiritual death.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. Yeah.
So Calvinism, on the other hand, argues, no, Christ died a spiritual death. Well, this creates a problem. How can this Christ, as the second person of the Trinity, be separated from God?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's two ways you could do with that. One way is to destroy the Holy Trinity. And you have the Father and the Son and the Trinity being separated from each other. Calvinists even won't go there.
Right.
So they're not going to go there. So the only other way to do it is to argue that Christ's humanity, specifically his human soul, is separated from his divine nature on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And you find this if you read Peter Vermigli on the crucifixion. He says this explicitly. Right? They say Christ's humanity on the cross is what is condemned by the Father. Right? So they explicitly say this. So they're Nestorian on that count. Right? That by virtue of their view of atonement, in Christ's death, his divinity and humanity are separated.
You're not blowing up the Trinity, you're blowing up the incarnation.
Right.
Yeah.
Which isn't better.
Right.
Not really. But then the second count on which they're Nestorian is they believe in something called the extra Calvinisticum. They believe that after the incarnation and even after Christ's ascension and glorification, that his human body does not, there is no, what's called in Latin, the Communicatio idiomatum. There is no communication of properties between his divine nature and his human nature. So his human nature remains finite and can only be in one place at a time.
Okay, very clearly, he says that the Communicatio idiomatum is that the natures are, there's a communication of properties between the natures, and that the Calvinists disbelieve this, and that then they think that the human nature remains finite. And let's play this again, just to be clear.
That his human body does not, there is no, what's called in Latin, the Communicatio idiomatum. There is no communication of properties between his divine nature and his human nature. So his human nature remains finite and can only be in one place at a time. And they specifically argue this when they're arguing against the real presence in the Eucharist.
Okay, so Fr Stephen DeYoung thinks that the Communicatio idiomatum is that the properties of the natures are communicated to each other, and that this is orthodoxy. And this is supposedly in St John of Damascus. Let's check. This is Chalcedon 451. The distinction of natures being by no means taken away by the union, but rather the property of each nature being preserved. This is extremely important. If the humanity becomes infinite and gains the property of the divinity infinite, its property finite is no longer preserved. Okay? Let's go on to St. John of Damascus, as he makes this very clear. And remember, Fr Stephen DeYoung claims this is from, his position is in John of Damascus. Therefore, when we speak of the divinity, we do not attribute the properties of the humanity to it. Thus, we never speak of a passible or created divinity. Neither do we predicate the divine properties of the flesh, for we never speak of uncreated flesh or humanity. We do not say that there is an infinite humanity. The properties of each nature are not communicated to each other. Let me read this again. Therefore, when we speak of the divinity, we do not attribute the properties of the humanity to it. Thus, we never speak of a passible or created divinity. Neither do we predicate the divine properties of the flesh, for we never speak of an uncreated flesh or humanity. Okay, Fr Stephen DeYoung, I'm sorry. The Communicatio idiomatum is not that the properties of the natures are communicated to each other. So what is it? St. John explains. In the case of the person, however, whether we name it from both of the parts or from one of them, we attribute the properties of both natures to it. So the properties are attributed to the person. And thus, Christ, which name covers both together, Christ is the name of both natures, is called both God and man, created and uncreated, passible and impassible. So yes, we call Christ created. We apply the property created to the person. And whenever he is named Son of God and God from one of the parts, he receives the properties of the coexistent nature of the flesh, that is to say, and can be called passible God and crucified Lord of glory. This is how we say God died on the cross. It's through the Communicatio idiomatum. He doesn't die on the cross as being God, but insofar as the same one is also man. When again he is named man and the Son of Man, he, the person, is given the properties and splendors of the divine nature. He is called child before the ages and man without beginning, not as a child or a man, but as God, who is before the ages and became a child in latter times. Thus, then, is the manner of this exchange by which each nature communicates its own properties to each other through the identity of the person and their mutual immanence. The properties are not communicated to the nature, they're communicated to the person. This is how we can say of Christ, this is our God who was seen upon earth and conversed with men. And this man is uncreated, impassible, and uncircumscribed. The Synodicon also makes this very clear. To them who acknowledge in Christ one hypostasis, one person, with different essences, and attribute to the one person both created and uncreated, visible and invisible, the passible and impassible, the circumscribable and uncircumscribable, and then who apply on the one hand the divine essence, uncreatedness, and the like, and on the other hand acknowledge the word and icons, acknowledge with word and icons that the human nature has the other attributes accompanying circumscription, eternal memory. So again, the natures do not communicate their properties to each other. There's no such thing as an uncreated humanity. It's Apollinarianism. It's something else. And there's no such thing as a created divinity. The properties are not communicated to each nature. They are communicated to the person. Okay? This has massive ramifications for how we understand the incarnation, and obviously then how we understand soteriology and the atonement and everything else. So it's extremely vital to understand this very basic starting point. Also, ironically, by saying that the properties of each nature are applied to each other rather than to the person, as St John of Damascus says, and as the Synodicon says, is a confusion of person and nature. It ironically makes the natures their own subjects, right? Very confusing. So, what's the Communicatio idiomatum? Is it that the properties of the natures are applied to each other? No, that's not what it is. It's that the properties of the natures are applied to the person, and we can say, God died on the cross, a man made the heavens. I hope this video has been edifying. Continue to have a blessed Lent and a glorious Pascha.